Please be seated. The court is now in session. Today, the Chamber will continue the document hearing regarding the key documents relevant to the roles of the accused, Kieu Sampon, the document will be presented by the prosecution, and after the conclusion by the prosecution, the floor will be given to the lead co-lawyers regarding the same topic, and then the comment or objection by the defense teams, including Ieng Saris and Kieu Sampon, for those documents to be presented by the prosecution regarding the roles of the accused. Mr. Dojpari, could you report the attendance of the parties and individuals to today's proceeding? Dojpari, Mr. President, for today's proceeding, all parties to this case are present, except the accused Nuon Chea, who is absent due to his health reasons. However, he waived his direct presence for the document hearing. The accused Ieng Sari is present in the holding cell downstairs due to his health reason. Thank you. President, thank you. Before I hand the floor to the prosecution, I'd like to inquire from Nuon Chea's defense. On the afternoon of the 31st January 2013, the Chamber actually queried the Nuon Chea's defense regarding Nuon Chea's position and willingness to waive his presence to hearing the testimony of TCW 100 and or TCCP 116. Have you obtained any consent from your client?
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honours. Good morning, Council. As you are aware, Mr. President, our client was released from the hospital last Thursday, but brought again, unfortunately, to the hospital Saturday night, where he is still at this very moment. We were able to speak to our client yesterday, and he has instructed us, and he has actually signed a waiver to that effect, that we can continue with the civil party as proposed by Your Honours last Thursday, but he does not waive his right to be present during the testimony of the proposed witness. So we could continue with the civil party, but not with the proposed witness.
President, thank you for the confirmation. The floor is now given to the prosecutor to continue their presentation regarding key documents related to the roles of the accused Kieu Sampon. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning, Your Honours. Good morning, Council, members of the public. As Your Honours will recall, we were looking at one of the books authored by Khieu Samphan before we broke at the last session on the 31st. Returning to that book now to put before Your Honours and the public a few more relevant passages. The document is entitled Considerations on the History of Cambodia from the Early Stage to the Period of Democratic Kampuchea, authored by Khieu Samphan, document E3/16, and we've been quoting from Chapter 5, and we will quote a few more passages from that chapter. And just by way of recalling where we left off, this was the passage that I had read just before we went to the break, and I might repeat it just to give context to the next part that we're going to be looking at. This is at Khmer ERN 00380-454, French 00643-883, and English 00498-277. And the passage related to Pol Pot's monitoring of senior cadre who were suspected of being traitors. Quote, "The evidence Philip Short provided about the Vietnamese having created the Khmer Rum Dok movement, together with the evidence that other researchers have discovered, makes it clear that all of Pol Pot's monitoring, following his 378 principle of Chakri, Chuk, Ya, and the other cadre who had operated with the Viet Minh, was correct. Thus, Philip Short was incorrect when he wrote, quote, the role of prison S21 and the confessions was not primarily to provide information, but rather to provide the proof of treason that they needed to arrest anyone they had already decided to arrest." End quote. The policy of independence from Vietnam required the implementation of absolute policies inside the country. And we will leave that passage and move on a little bit further down. In this section, which I had started to read from when we went to the break, Khieu Samphan discusses the deliberations, or his understanding of Pol Pot's deliberations on the confessions that had been extracted from suspected cadre. Now, of course, we're not reading this material for the content of the confessions, but rather for what it contains by way of commentary of Pol Pot's use of confessions and Khieu Samphan's understanding of that process. Khmer ERN 00380-457-458, French 00643-885, and English 00498-279. Discussing the confession of Khoi Thun. These responses were dated 4th of March 1977. As I understand it, in these responses there were three primary themes that may have caught Pol Pot's attention. Now I'll just insert here a note. It's a long passage, so we will only read two brief points, and the rest, of course, is available on the record. Point number one, quote, "These confessions may have led Pol Pot to believe Even more, that his arresting Ya was not wrong, and Ya may have been an individual that played an important role in the new party that they were setting up. And number two, but the issue that Pol Pot may have noticed most of all was related to the confessions of Khoi Tun, meaning Duon of Office 870 having given to Ya secret information of the Standing Committee on the matter of V and Lau, the Secretary and Deputy Secretary in Ratnakiri. Aside from Duon, no one had known this. One page down in all three languages, at footnote 193, Khieu Samphan discusses the circumstances of Duon's disappearance, arrest and disappearance, and the question of whether or not he, that is Khieu Samphan, replaced Duon as chairman of Office 870. And this is what he says. Quote, "There is some opinion that after Duon's arrest, I rose to become Office 870 chairman to replace him. In fact, that is untrue. I do not know whom the Standing Committee assigned to replace Duon. As I have already said, secrecy was very firm at that time. Even inside the same unit, inside Office 870, there was still secrecy. I did not even want to know or hear about what Duon did or where he went. All along, he was not at the office very much. My wife was in charge of the kitchen and left food on the table for him. Very frequently, he was not seen to come to eat. After a long time, we seemed to get used to this situation. Where Duon went to and came from was not given any thought. So then, neither my wife nor I knew he had been arrested. We thought even less about who they appointed in his place." And in a few moments, we will be looking at excerpts of statements by others familiar with the functioning of the leadership on this issue of replacement of Duon. There are a few more passages in this book that we wish to quote from today. The next passage appears to draw a distinction between the withdrawal of food from cooperatives by the party centre and the relationship with Vietnam, or the suspicion of Vietnamese subversion. This is at Khmer ERN 00380-472 to 473, French 00643-894, and English 00498-287. Quote, "Depriving the people of rice in order to transport rice to the state to meet quotas led to a great loss of life. In this, another question that arises is, was the Vietnamese sticking of their heads deep inside to stir up the CPK that appeared clearly in 1973 over or not during the 1975 to 1978? Regardless, the turmoil at the time was an important factor that led many good cadre who had in the past been loyal to the cause and had been active in combat to turn to retreat instead. We should understand their hesitance facing this situation. But the many attempts of the Vietnamese communist leaders and their ultimatum in May 1976 made Pol Pot and the CPK leadership reach the conclusion that, quote, smashing the internal latch doors doorkeepers of the Vietnamese is the only way to keep Kampuchea alive. In a word, the issue was massively complicated. Khieu Samphan then addresses the issue of the forced evacuation of the cities in 1975 and the considerations that led to that decision. And here he is critiquing, it appears, the work of researchers who have considered this issue. This is at Khmer ERN 00380-493 to 494, French 00643-907, and English 00498-300. And it's in a section entitled Number 2, Some Situations or Events that Researchers Did Not Think About. Quote, they have made accusations against Pol Pot about the evacuation of the people from Phnom Penh and the provincial towns, but in making those accusations, they did not think about the incredibly difficult and violence-filled situation that the young and immature state authority faced. In the next paragraph, he says the following. The thing that might have led to great danger for the young and immature state authority was the situation in which tens of thousands of people had already died, and there were people who were lying in wait to keep on killing one another like that. These were very favourable conditions for the CIA agents to conduct sabotage and join with the remnants of the former Lon Nol army that had clearly hidden weapons in the city and in locations throughout the country to create rebellion in Phnom Penh and various other locations in the country. The greatest danger was that this rebellion and turmoil would create the opportunity for Vietnam to easily intervene from the outside and seize Kampuchea back from America under the pretext of coming to rescue it. At the time, in actuality, like it or not, the CIA and the Vietnamese communists were joining together to kill the new state authority. This was the situation that the leaders of the Khmer Rouge were most worried about. Further on in the same chapter, he discusses, or he builds on, this dynamic between the leadership of the CPK and the Vietnamese, or rather the suspicions on the part of the leadership of the CPK vis-à-vis the Vietnamese. Khmer ERN 00380-498 to 499, French 00643-909 to 910, and English 00498-302. Quote, if the Vietnamese had liberated the South before Phnom Penh had been liberated, there may have been major danger. Having outrun them once, after liberation, it was imperative to run again. There could be no hesitation. This is why Pol Pot saw the expansion of high-level cooperatives throughout the country had made the revolution in Kampuchea 30 years faster than the revolutions in China, North Korea, and Vietnam. And further down, another relevant passage. Quote, were it not for the organisation of the cooperatives, Kampuchea would have had to suffer all the consequences of the situation in Vietnam, including respecting the 1973 Paris Agreement between Vietnam and America. In late 1972 and early 1973, because of raising the level of the cooperatives that had been previously organised to high-level cooperatives, the Khmer Rouge were able to continue to struggle independently. Again, a little bit further down on the following page, he looks at the imperative to carry out socialist revolution, and what is of interest here is that he seems to be speaking in the first person, using the we. Khmer ERN 003804999 to 500, French 00643-910, and English 00498-300. Quote, expressed differently, in order to get dams and crisscrossing feeder canals to irrigate the Kampuchean countryside, when we wanted to sort out sufficient food quickly, when we wanted to escape from poverty, when we wanted to modernize agriculture, when we wanted to lay the foundation to move in steps towards industrialization, we had to carry out socialist revolution. And each of us in the organization, and all of us, had to strive to fight to eradicate private ownership and equip ourselves and our units with, quote, collective stance. In the next sentence, but to reach those goals, since the country had just emerged from a war of destruction and was facing the dangers of starvation and death, the first initiative was to overcome the situation of incredible hardship that the young and immature state authorities had to face. So then, some coercion was required for a while. Coercion to work in a situation of lacking everything for both those who were used to it and those who were not, because time was very urgent. And finally, Your Honours, towards the end of Chapter 5, some reflections on the Democratic Kampuchea movement and reasons that Khieu Samphan joined it. Khmer ERN 00380-503 to 04, French 00649-912 to 913, and English 00498-305. Quote, it is my understanding that the Democratic Kampuchea movement played an important role during a period of our nation's history that no one may scratch out or erase. If someone were to scratch out or erase or change it, the scratches or the erasures could be seen. Why? Because it is clear that Saloth Sa, or Pol Pot, sacrificed his life to fight the Americans and fight the Vietnamese communists to defend the sovereignty of the nation. And both of them had tricky maneuvers to attract or confuse the forces of the nation and internal forces to go along with them. So then the fight was very intense for our small country. In 1960, I, like the other, quote, progressive intellectuals, had the profound objective of an independent economy as a foundation for the independence of my country, and with a firm will wanted to end the special privileges and corruption that had led to a handful but increasing number of people who did not know how to be embarrassed about the endless suffering of huge masses of people. I strived to fight with the means I had when I was a member of the parliament, but I lost, and I was forced to flee from Phnom Penh to save my life. I took shelter under the protection of a movement that, according to some people whom I had known in Paris, was striving toward similar goals, but which used a different method that I could not. Now my views are still the same. They have not changed. And there, Your Honours, we'll move on to the next record that we wish to quote from. And this is Khieu Samphan's other book that is publicly available. It is entitled Cambodia's Recent History and the Reasons Behind the Decisions I Made. The E number is E3/18, and by way of introduction, Your Honours will recall that we quoted from this book in our presentation of documents relevant to Khieu Samphan's role in the pre-1975 period. We will look at a few passages today where Khieu Samphan discusses the events during the Democratic Kampuchea period. And in particular, some of the information he learned or became privy to through his attendance of meetings of the leadership. And I will begin with Khmer ERN 00103 840, French 00595 431 to 32, and English 00103 752. During the Central Committee's successive meetings, however, particularly during the first year, certain abuses were noted and severely criticised. Directives were given to correct them. For example, return to smaller cooperatives. They were easier to manage. Improve working conditions in the fields. The number of people sent to the fields was to match the number of mattocks, shovels, baskets or other tools. The other workers were to be allowed to rest in the village or do lighter work, such as making baskets. Establish a rest schedule, which was to be 3 days a month. During those 3 days, extra rations were to be provided. Technicians were to be recalled to run the factories in Phnom Penh, and a certain number of intellectuals were to be returned to the capital to participate in technical education projects, such as the creation of a vocational training school. The relevance of these passages, of course, is the extent to which the central bodies of the CPK were, it appears, according to Khieu Samphan, managing the conditions in the countryside or giving instructions. The next passage I wish to quote from also reflects on meetings, although this time of the Standing Committee that Khieu Samphan attended, and views about Pol Pot as a leader. Khmer ERN 00103 843 to 844, French 00595 436 to 437, and English 00103 754 to 755. Quote, in a word, Pol Pot represented the historical leader who was never wrong when it came to making important decisions. Judging from what I saw during the expanded sessions of the Permanent Bureau, however, nothing approaching fear was apparent during those meetings. Indeed, the meetings were informal. They were more like a family reunion. Members would often take time out to tell jokes. However, because everyone had great confidence in Pol Pot, they accepted most of the ideas and analyses without much discussion. Once, when a member of the Central Committee and later a member of the Permanent Committee was arrested, the committee's leadership's confidence in Pol Pot did not waver. The committee considered each disappearance as a separate case and probably, in the eyes of the insiders, justified. In the next passage that we will quote from, Khieu Samphan discusses the reasons he joined, or rather he accepted the role as President of the State Presidium of Democratic Kampuchea and the country's Chief of, or rather Head of State. This is a Khmer ERN 00103 846 to 847, French 00595 443, and English 00103 757. And of course, by way of introduction, Your Honours, last week we looked at the confidential deliberations on the resignation of the late Norodom Sihanouk and Khieu Samphan's attendance at those meetings. Quote, "The Khmer Rouge leaders accepted the Prince's resignation in April 1976, and the title of President of Democratic Kampuchea was handed over to me. Despite my embarrassment, I thought, in my soul and conscience, that had I refused the post, I would have been failing in my patriotic duty. All things considered, and seeing how the Vietnamese leaders were behaving between 1970 and 1975, I thought that the fears of the communist Khmer leaders were legitimate, and I did not want to see the mobilized national force they represented weakened." And the last passage that I wish to read from today is brief and relates to the arrests in Preah Vihear, which Khieu Samphan also confirmed he knew of during his interviews with the co-investigating judges. The relevant ERNs for this passage of the book are as follows: Khmer 00103 891, French 00595 513, and English 00103 793. Near the middle of 1978, I did hear of massive arrests and atrocities committed in Preah Vihear province. It was my wife who, in tears, told me of the atrocities committed against her brothers, her relatives, and many other innocent victims. But at that time, the liberation of victims and the arrest of the provincial secretary of the party led me to believe that the arrests were an isolated case. Next, Your Honours, I propose to refer briefly to statements of others who, as I indicated earlier, discuss Khieu Samphan's role in Office 870, in particular following the disappearance of Suavasi alias Dawn, the former chief of that office. Document E3/190 is a report or a summary of a discussion held with Ying Seri by Steve Hedder on the 4th of January 1999. And I will read a brief passage. Khmer ERN 00172-248, French 00607-965, and English 000-815-72. Quote, and here he is referring to his discussion with Ying Seri. Quote, I press him to compare Khieu Samphan's role with his own. He confirmed Khieu Samphan's elevation to the Central Committee in 1976 and his later appointment to chairmanship of Office 870. He asserted that in the latter capacity, Khieu Samphan would have seen many more documents of a general nature than him, but not necessarily documents related to executions and torture. He insisted that Khieu Samphan had, like him, continued to believe that CPK cadre arrested were being, quote, re-educated, not executed. Confirmation of Khieu Samphan's elevation to Office 870 is also found in document E190.1.72, which we will not be presenting today in line with Your Honour's instructions, and we will be presenting that document during the examination of one of the upcoming experts, as you have directed us. And lastly, on statements by others in relation to Khieu Samphan's role within the leadership, document E3/464 is a written record of an interview of witness Ta Sot. As we discussed last week, Your Honours, Ta Sot is deceased, according to the information on the case file. And Your Honours may recall that we've heard evidence in this trial from witness Sa Siek, who is Ta Sot's wife. In his interview, by way of introduction, Ta Sot explains that he was a regimental commander with some 500 soldiers under his command in the North Zone, and in that capacity he participated in the attacks on Phnom Penh. For present purposes, I will quote from passages where he discusses the role of Chim Sam Auk, alias Pong, and the leadership of the CPK. This can be found at Khmer ERN 00204-741, French 00503-948, and English 00226-106. And he says the following: Pong controlled all officers of the A's, that is capital A, such as K1, K2, K3, K4, K7, and K12. Pong was with Uncle Pol Pot. Before he made any decision, first he had to meet with Pol Pot Pong then disseminated the order to other officers. Pang received the joint order from all uncles such as Pol Pot, Ieng Sary, Khieu Samphan, Nuon Chea, in accordance with their expertise, in brackets, tasks and directions. Pong managed along in all offices of the A's. Pong used to meet with Khieu Samphan at K3 and Khieu Samphan used to meet Pong at K7. I saw that. Pong was the chief of Office 870 until he died in 1976. And just one more passage of relevance. This is the second last question and answer in the interview. He says the following, quote, "I used to deliver the letters to the provinces. However, I did not know what was written because the envelopes were sealed. Some letters were from Uncle Pol Pot, Uncle Nuon Chea, Uncle Khieu Samphan, and Uncle Ieng Sary. But mostly the letters were coming from Uncle Nuon Chea and Pol Pot, who had them sent to the designated zone chiefs." And a little bit further down in the same passage, quote, "I used to deliver the letters from Pol Pot, Nuon Chea, Ieng Sary, Khieu Samphan to Chief of Pre Vihia Sector Man, Chief of Siem Reap Sector Sot, Chief of Pre Vang Zone Sao Pim, Chief of Stung Treng Sector V, Chief of Krati Sector Tom, Chief of Persat Sector Q, deceased, Chief of Battambang Sector Yim, deceased, Chief of Kampot Sector Tamok, deceased, Chief of Kampong Spu Sector C, deceased. I knew that the letters from the uncles were sent to the regions, districts and villages, but I did not deliver them." And the second last document that we wish to present today, Your Honours, is E3/3512. It is a journal article written by Ben Kiernan, which discusses the role of Khieu Samphan during the Democratic Kampuchea period. And it is in fact a response to the second book from which I quoted earlier. And I will start with this passage. At Khmer ERN 00755-594, rather that was the French ERN, the Khmer ERN is 00758-170, English is 00804-75. Like most Cambodians, Sihanouk has since seen everything, but unlike them, Samphan has learnt little. Having taken to the jungle, he emerged 32 years later without much to add. Vainly discreet, he seems unaware how much documentation of the internal workings of his regime is now in the public domain. Two paragraphs down, he states the following, quote, "Samphan thinks people will believe him, or rather, I will read that again. quote, Sampan thinks people will believe that only patriotism kept him going and that he accepted the job of head of state after the 1975 CPK victory only out of duty to his country. It is astonishing that he pleads near total ignorance of the genocide which occurred when he was head of state, 1976 to 1979. He claims that rarely specified, quote, Khmer Rouge leaders, not him, bore sole responsibility for those deeds and failed to keep him informed. For all DK's crimes, which he is shocked, exclamation mark, to discover now, Sampan expects sympathy from the surviving victims. Though based at CPK headquarters, for instance, Sampan claims he was profoundly upset by his party's forced evacuation of Phnom Penh on its fall in April 1975. While others, like Hu Yun, opposed it, Sampan calls the evacuation something, quote, I was not expecting at all. Meanwhile, the CPK had forcibly collectivized the countryside. Quote, great was my surprise, end of quote, he claims, on learning this soon after the 1975 victory. Until then, he could have been the sole Cambodian in the countryside unaware of its collectivization. Documentary evidence belies Sampan's claimed ignorance of high-level policy at every turn. He admits to full membership of the CPK Central Committee from 1976, but not of its powerful Standing Committee, SC. He says he attended only, quote, enlarged SC meetings. However, the extant minutes for 1975 to 1976 record Sampan in attendance at 12 of 14 SC meetings. Quote, in brackets, gatherings not enlarged by lesser invitees. Sampan indeed attended the CPK's closed, high-level deliberations. After the point when he now concedes learning of the urban deportations and rural collectivization, party documents reveal not only Sampan's important role in the regime, but his awareness of looming purges. On October 9, 1975, he attended the SC meeting at which it appointed itself as Cambodia's secret government. The minutes rank Sampan fourth in the cabinet hierarchy after Pol Pot, Nuon Chea and Ieng Sary. At this closed meeting, Pol Pot targeted a general, Chan Chakri. Quote, we must pay attention to what he says to see if he is a traitor who will deprive himself of any future. Then, moving also against Chakri's deputy, Pol Pot added, we must be totally silent. We must watch their activities. And the last passage from this article that I wish to read is at Khmer ERN 00758-173 to 174, French 007559596, and English 000800476. Quote, Sampan was not so quiet about the fate of Hu Nim, a leftist parliamentarian who, unlike Sampan, protested DK policies and was arrested in April 1977. Nim's torturer reported, quote, we whipped him 4 or 5 times to break his stand before taking him to be stuffed with water. End of quote. Sampan may not have read that report, but knowing Nim was in danger, he stated on the radio the next day, quote, we must wipe out the enemy, neatly and thoroughly. and suppress all stripes of enemy at all times. On July 6, CPK security forces massacred Hunim and 126 others. Posing now as a victim, Sampan claims Nim as, quote, my friend, and recoils at the, quote, suffering in his soul and in his body. What a nightmare, end of quote. This performance cannot convince us of Sampan's claimed naivety, or that at the time he was unaware even of the existence of massacres and crimes. Mr. President, the last document or record that we wish to put before you today is an excerpt from a video recording, which is indeed a documentary that we've seen parts of before. It is entitled Pol Pot and Khieu Samphan Facing Genocide. The document number is E109/2.3R. This is a 6-minute and 20-second segment in which Khieu Samphan discusses the crimes committed during the Democratic Kampuchea period, his alleged responsibility, and the role played by Pol Pot, and lastly, the role of the prison S-21. So, Mr. President, with your permission, we will ask the AV section now to play a video which in their table is found under J2. If we have your permission, President, I will ask the AV unit to now play that video.
The President, you may proceed. Both officials are now instructed to make sure that the video clip is displayed.
Conceptet här, quand est-ce que vous avez réalisé la magnitude de massacre?
When I came back to Pailin in the end of 1998, I heard talk of massacres. But to learn about S-21 properly, I had to see a film by Richie Pan. What was your first reaction when you understood that? When you saw the suffering? My first reaction was surprise. When you realized that they had killed elderly people and children in mass, weren't you horrified? I was still surprised. Why these killings after the victory? But weren't you horrified by the killings of all these children? But who killed them? That was the point. I can't imagine that it was Pol Pot who killed the children. Tell me when you saw Pol Pot killing or torturing children. Tell me. Many murderers were children as well. They were selected and trained by the Khmer Rouge. What do you think of those children? Please, please. I told you about Cambodian street kids in the 1970s. They wanted to enlist in the army, and they were encouraged by their parents. if you please. So that's how it was. They were participating in the liberation of the country. They felt they had to do something to fight for social equality, which they hadn't had since the post-Angkor Wat period. The youngest at S21 were only 10 years old. Do you realize that? I don't know the reason for that. But a few youngsters is not a reason to erase a whole period of history. But what can make a 10-year-old child want to kill other children? I don't know the reason. You have to dig deep to find the answer. That's why I say that there are a lot of things that still remain to be investigated. You have to realize that without Pol Pot, without the Khmer Rouge, after the 1970 coup d'etat, Cambodia would have been in the hands of the Vietnamese communists. Now, if you please, don't forget that. And what does it mean to be in the hands of the Vietnamese? What does it mean to us Cambodians? What would that have meant? It wouldn't have taken long for the whole of Cambodia to become a part of Vietnam. Millions of Cambodians live in South Vietnam today. Do you know how the Cambodians live in the south of Vietnam today? I'll tell you. It's an immense S21, isn't it? So they talk about the little S21 here, so as to make people forget that gigantic S21 over there in South Vietnam. It's a very clever manipulation. They're manipulating world opinion. They present Cambodia and Pol Pot, demonizing Pol Pot, to make people forget the other side. They accuse him of being a dictator and use the word genocide. It's not correct. A great leader of such a movement could never act like that. If so, he wouldn't have been able to create this movement. I'm going to shout that out loud at the trial.
Your Honours, that concludes our presentations of documents relevant to the role of the accused Khieu Samphan during the Democratic Kampuchea period. We thank you for time allocated for this presentation, and we conclude here. Thank you.
President, thank you, the prosecution. The floor is now given to the lead co-lawyers for civil parties. If you wish to make any comment supplementary to the presentation made by the prosecution regarding the roles of the accused Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan, you may proceed if you wish to do so.
Mr. President, good morning. Your Honors, good morning. Good morning to all parties. I will remind this chamber once again that as far as the civil parties are concerned, we will be presenting our documents following the outcome of these proceedings. The chamber has asked us to abide by international jurisprudence by stating that we could not introduce any documents. Pardon me, I'll restart. That we would not be admitted to introduce any documents without allowing the defense to hear from the authors of this document. We therefore believe that would be logical to hear documents and testimony on the role of the accused, after which we would be presenting our documents. Based on our initial list, we have identified a certain number of civil parties who would be speaking to the role, acts and conduct of the accused. And if they are to be confronted by the defense, pursuant to jurisprudence, we would only then be in a position to introduce documents. Once again, we believe that it would be logical for us to make our presentation of documents following the end of the proceedings and following the summons of particular witnesses. Thank you.
President, thank you for your comment, but I think there is a misunderstanding here. The floor is given to the lead co-lawyers for civil parties if you wish to make additional comment to the documents presented by the prosecution regarding the roles of the accused, the two accused. That is Mr. Ieng Sari and Mr. Khieu Sampon. And I clearly stated that the floor is given to you if you have additional comments to make. Of course, we clearly understand your proposal that you cannot prepare the document on time for your submission regarding the roles of the accused. That is a separate matter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President, for that clarification, which is entirely appropriate. At this stage, we have no comments to make on the presentation of documents made by the co-prosecutors. Thank you.
President, thank you. The floor is now given to Ieng Sari's defense so that you can make a comment or objections to the documents presented by the prosecution regarding the role of your client, Ieng Sari. You may proceed. Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Good morning, everyone in and around the courtroom. I have some observations and comments to make. First of all, we reserve the rights to make our objections to certain documents as my colleague and I raised. That is the categories of documents, not the particular document itself. Secondly, it is my observation, and as I raised it earlier, the prosecution made some documentary presentation to support the alleged facts regarding the crimes and not just the roles of the accused. And my third observation and objection is the following. The prosecution have attempted to present the written records of interviews of witnesses. For instance, that of the witness Tha Sot, and Tha Sot is deceased, and his wife So Sik also confirmed before this chamber that she never heard her husband Tha Sot say anything about what he did during the time under the Khmer Rouge regime. And that is my observation and objection in the third point. If a written record of interview of a deceased witness is used, then the opposing parties, in particular the defense, do not have the opportunity to question the interviewee, and for that reason, this kind of record shall be removed from the case. Thank you, Mr. President. President, thank you. The floor is now given to Khieu Samphan's defense so that you can make a comment or express your objections to the documents presented by the prosecution regarding the roles of your client, Khieu Samphan. You may proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First and foremost, good morning to you, good morning to honorable members of the bench, good morning to all parties. Just a few comments on the presentation of key documents made by the co-prosecutors, specifically relevant to Mr. Khieu Samphan. My first comment would be to remind this chamber that at this particular stage at which we are presenting key documents is rather delicate, since this is not the end of the proceedings. Obviously, there's a very fine line between presentation of documents and confusion. Last week, my learned friend, Mr. Kope, said that the terms used by the co-prosecutor lent themselves to a pleading rather than a demonstration of the relevance of the documents he sought to present. This is a very important point to retain, because I realize the difficulty of this exercise and the possibilities available to the prosecution. What I can say today is that I will resist from making final closing arguments. However, I do wish to present to you some general observations. The first is as follows. As indicated, with respect to a letter signed by the deceased King Father, which was introduced by Mr. Abdullah, I would note that it is rather regretful that the co-prosecutor should only at this particular stage cite such a document when his testimony would have been rather intriguing and interesting, as he has made many statements and there is significant footage of the deceased King Father, and at this time it is too late to hear more from him. And it is impossible to put questions before this chamber. Having access to the archives is one matter, but carrying out a discussion and inquiring on the probative value within these chambers is an entirely different matter. The second observation is as follows. During these sets of hearings on the presentation of documents relevant to Mr. Kyu Sompong, it would appear that the co-prosecutor, the international co-prosecutor, has circumvented certain procedures with respect to some of the documents on trade and commerce. I do hope to remind this chamber that the written record of Mr. Sakim Lamut, cited by the co-prosecutors, questionable, including the way certain telegrams were delivered. But once again, this is not something that I am able to delve into, given the restrictions of these proceedings, because once again, they speak to the merits of the case. The third observation I wish to make at this particular point in time, as was raised by my learned friend for the civil parties, there are certain documents for which the full significance and the full meaning can only be understood if we were to hear direct evidence from their authors. And this may go to future testimony, which is particularly important. We've also lodged objections to the testimony of those who are deceased or absent. And I've spoken at length about the testimony of Ben Kiernan, a university researcher who's already demonstrated that he is disinclined to appear before this chamber. Yet he is the author of several key documents, and the fact that we are not hearing from him leaves me rather astonished and perplexed. These documents concern him, and yet, once again, we simply do not have the possibility to cross-examine him. That is an additional comment. My final comment is quite specific to a document that raises several issues, and that recurs in many documents. There seem to be translation discrepancies that may have an impact on the meaning. I would refer you to document E3/165. As cited in English by the co-prosecutor, the document makes reference to a speech supposedly delivered by Mr. Kyu Sompong. To be more specific, I will quote what the international co-prosecutor read on the 31st of January. And I would refer your honors to the draft transcript of the French version just prior to 10:15 a.m. The co-prosecutor stated as follows: the next relevant document pertaining to Mr. Kyu Sompong's activities on the creation of a new state is E3/175, which is a document that we have previously sought to have admitted. A little bit later, after 10:15, the co-prosecutor indicated that this document is rather lengthy. However, I will only cite one passage where we can find a speech given by Mr. Kyu Sompong. I will give you the specific references to the documents. With a special note that the English version cited by the co-prosecutor is not a translation that was written by the ECCC, but rather a translation provided by DC CAM. For the sake of clarity, I will provide you the version in English, the DC CAM English translation. I will then provide you with our French translation, which was based on the original Khmer. And with the assistance of my colleague, Mr. Kom Sonon, I will ask him to read in Khmer exactly what the original text says. Once again, I refer to document E3/165. The first excerpt that I wish to draw your attention to is on English ARN page 00184-048. This is a summary of the document entitled in French, document on the first conference of the first legislature of the People's Representative Assembly of Kampuchea, April 11 to 13, 1976. The English version, as cited by the International Co-Prosecutor, reads, and I will cite this in English.
Speech by the chairman of the Presidium at the opening of the first legislature of the People's Representative Assembly of Kampuchea. En français.
In French, based on the original Khmer, can be found on ERN page 00301-335. In the literal translation of the French reads, opening speech of the President of Delegates of the First Congress of the First Legislature of the Assembly of Representatives. And for the sake of clarity, I will seek the assistance of my learned colleague so that he may read into the record the original Khmer, which can be found on ERN 000-536. I will now cede the floor over to my colleague.
Excusez-moi, mon ERN.
I beg your pardon. I believe that my ERN numbers were not complete. It's 000-536-04.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to read the relevant portion as indicated by my international colleague. The document E3/165. And the title of the document has already been indicated by my international colleagues. That is the first session of the General Assembly of the People's Representative Assembly dated 11 to 13 April 1976. The title of the document has already been outlined by my international colleague, and there was an incorrect translation of that in the English version. Allow me to read in Khmer the speech made by the chairman of the dignitary, but the English translation is the chairman of the presidium. We can actually rely upon the Khmer version with ERN 000-53610, which clearly states that it is the speech made by the chairman of the dignitary at the opening of the first legislature of the People's Representative Assembly of Kampuchea. So actually the content of the table of content is not in full, and if you refer to page 9 of the document, it clearly states the full title. Thank you, Mr. President.
Et pour continuer,
To continue on the same vein, the same translation error appears within the same document on the English ERN page 00184-051. That reads,
Presidium to take the place of honor. Alors que le RN en français
whereas the French equivalent on 00301-338 reads, invite the president of the delegates to take the place of honor. On the ERN of the original Khmer, on which the French translation is based, 000-536-09. Once again, the accurate term is used. These translation errors recur a third time within the same document on ERN English 00184-052. I repeat, 00184052. This is the DC Cam translation. And it refers to a speech of the chairman of the Presidium at the opening of the first conference of the first legislature of the People's Representative Assembly of Kampuchea. Whereas the equivalent French version, which again is based on the original Khmer, 00301-339. The translation reads, the speech of the President of Delegates at the opening of the first conference of the first legislature of the People's Representative Assembly of Kampuchea. The original Khmer can be found on 00-536-10. It goes without saying that since we have gone to great lengths in order to demonstrate the discrepancies between the three versions, there is reference to the Presidium in the document used by DC Cam, and it is misleading and not, in actual fact, a speech of the President of the Presidium, but a speech made by the Chairman or President of the representatives or dignitaries of the People's Representative of Kampuchea. We would therefore hereby request that the Chamber oversee rectification of this error. We believe that it is a rather grave mistake. And we may have to evoke this issue once again before Your Honours, because, as you have seen, this has a great impact on the meaning and relevance of these documents. Those are the comments I wish to make. I have no other observations which would not lend themselves to a closing argument at this point, but I do remain available to this court's translation services in order to specify once again these particular issues and discrepancies. And I hope that the ERN numbers will be of use. Thank you.
President, the prosecution, please wait. Mr. Laverne, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. A first question to Council Guisset. Has a request already been made to the translation services to make a correction, if necessary, to the mistake which you believe is contained in the document? Response, Mr. Laverne. No, we have not yet indicated this mistake. We didn't do so before the document was presented. We were working in our team on the English document and on the Khmer document, and it was only during the hearing when we heard it read out by the international co-prosecutor that we actually pinpointed the translation problem. So we wish to advise the Chamber that we certainly intend to do so, as you suggest, but the absence of any request at this stage is due to the fact that we only understood there was a mistake very recently. Judge Laverne, another question I'd like to ask you concerns this idea of the president of delegates or representatives. As you are aware, is there any document that specifies precisely what this function of president of delegates is? I personally don't remember having ever seen an explanation of that. And then, of course, that would allow us to understand whether or not there is actually a mistake.
Council Kung Som On. Thank you very much, Judge Laverne. Please allow me to respond to you on this. I already stated concerning the errors we found on the document. Indeed, the error is corrected in another paragraph of the same document. And document under ERN 0053604, the brief statement is about the speech made by the chairman of the meeting. And you asked us who could have been the chairman or of the dignitary in the meeting. So I would like to refer to the same document 0053610 under the big heading Council, says the President. Please hold on, because the CD has run out of space. We would need to have a new one replaced. The President, since it is now appropriate moment for the adjournment, the Chamber will adjourn for 20 minutes. The next session will be resumed by 5 to 11.